This is an encore presentation to a webinar I gave several months ago, and we're going to cover some of the similar topics, but add to the discussion a bit. This whole topic of IT alignment and the role of business capabilities is becoming very hot in many organizations today, and it's a very timely topic. So I'm going to get into the presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end. And control given to, there we go. Okay. So I'd like to start with a little Dilbert. I think we all feel we live in a Dilbert cartoon at times, maybe many times. I think this is a accurate portrayal of what I see in many organizations where everybody wants to believe that what they're doing is aligned with the strategy of the organization somehow. And in an ideal world, everything we do would be aligned with the strategy of the organization. And I think we all talk about our strategic plans and our strategic fit. However, if we go to the next slide, according to Michael Porter, I'm sure many of you have heard of Michael Porter, very famous author, researcher. More than 80% of organizations today, not just corporations, do not successfully execute their business strategies. And he goes on to estimate that in a majority of these cases, over 70%, the reason's not necessarily a flaw in the strategy itself, but in poor execution. And this failure to execute is often cited as one of the most significant challenges in organizations of all types today. And this is really this execution layer is the layer that in most organizations may not exist or not exist very well, and is really a role for enterprise architecture to be this bridge between strategy and execution if the EA practice is set up correctly and staffed appropriately. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. According to Gartner, 75% of IT projects fail outright or fail to meet, a large part of their original objectives. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody on the call. There's different statistics out there on project failure. They're all fairly high around this rate. So it's not surprising that oftentimes of IT and business alignment often cited as a reason for this failure of IT projects or failure of IT execution. But let's examine this whole notion of business and IT alignment. Is that really what we should be striving for? And is it even really possible? So if you go out and Google it, you'll find, many pages of information on alignment. We've been talking about alignment now for at least 20 years. And I would argue that many of our organizations are no better aligned today than they were 20 years ago. On the surface, the notion of IT business alignment makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that all parts of the organization should be aligned with your corporate strategy. But IT tends to get, I think, singled out more than many other areas. If we look at we'll talk a little bit about the history of alignment and how the thinking around alignment has progressed. But most alignment discussions and alignment research goes back to or originates around the time of the Henderson model in 1993, where Henderson makes the case that IT strategy and business strategy can be aligned and should be aligned, and that then the corresponding infrastructures will be aligned as well. And we'll tear this apart in a second. For enterprise architecture, if positioned appropriately in the organization and with the right mix of resources and staffing, can and should be the bridge or the linchpin between strategy and execution. This is the part that's either missing or not working very well in many organizations today. So this failure to execute is something it's a huge problem in organizations of all types today, and EA could be that bridge to help alleviate this failure. Look at different traditional domains of enterprise architecture. We have the business architecture, data architecture, application architecture, and the technical or infrastructure architecture. These are the traditional domains in the traditional model that's typically assigned or attributed to enterprise architecture. Very IT-centric. Three of the four layers are, squarely IT domains. Most enterprise architecture frameworks have you identify the current state in these different domains to one degree or another, and then your desired future state, and then specify a process from taking you from current state to future state. And that's the typical, all the frameworks do this in a bit slightly different way, but this is essentially the goal of most of the EA frameworks out there today. What's missing in this model, in the traditional worldview, which I would argue our traditional EA frameworks have this traditional worldview, where IT is separate from the rest of the organization. And I think our educational programs and at the university level foster this separation, where IT is typically the domain of the engineering or computer science school. Those students typically take very few, if any, business courses. And then in the business school, those students get very little IT education beyond spreadsheets and analytics. So they don't really understand what the IT folks do and don't really have much of a technical acumen. And conversely, the IT folks don't really understand how to communicate their value and what they can do in terms that the rest of the business understands and values. So that's the traditional alignment worldview that supports this notion that IT is separate and distinct and can and should be aligned better with the rest of the organization. Whereas a better worldview, and I think a more contemporary worldview, is that IT is just another part of the business, and it should be thought of and evaluated the same as all of our other functional areas of the business. So I think it'd be hard to say that any other area of the business should be less aligned with business strategy than IT. So why do we tend to single out IT? Comes from, this is some work from Len Feskins at the Open Group. He's suggesting I think a more forward-looking enterprise architecture model and perhaps a future framework that is focused around terms and concepts that are understood and valued by the rest of the business, that's not overly IT-centric. So, for example, when you're talking infrastructure, you're not just talking about IT infrastructure. I'm talking about routers and servers solely. You're talking about all physical and intangible assets of the organization. And this is the kind of thinking we need to adopt and evolve into if we're going to be an enterprise-wide resource and really valued and understood, and the contributions that we can make be valued by the rest of the business. We need to think and talk and work in terms that the rest of the business understands, not in IT-centric terms. And more on some of the different domains. This isn't anything you're going to find out on the web yet. It's just some work Len's doing and socializing. But I agree with the idea. Whether this becomes the future EA stack or not remains to be seen. But I think that's one of the criticisms of the current enterprise architecture frameworks, is that they were developed by IT people for IT people, yet we say they apply to the entire enterprise, and they really don't. They apply to the IT organization. So there's quite a bit of evolution that needs to be done there to be a true enterprise-wide discipline and resource. So let's back for a second and take a look at some of the thinking, some of the major milestone research articles around alignment, and talk about how our thinking around alignment has evolved over the last 20 plus years. This is not an all-inclusive list, obviously, of all the articles that have been written on alignment, but it's some of maybe a few of the more seminal pieces that got a lot of attention. Henderson model. This, as I said, goes back to 1993. This is considered, kind of the grandfather. Henderson's considered kind of the grandfather of strategic alignment. His argument was that the inability to realize value from IT investments is due primarily